Hi, I'm Gareth Green and welcome to this Composer Insight video. We're going to be thinking about the first prelude written by Debussy, and it's about block chords being used in a particular kind of haunting way. And we want to discover, well, how does Debussy create that kind of haunting quality? Is there something for composers to think about in terms of how do we create that kind of mood? Is it something for performers working with this piece to think about? So I'm going to focus this on just the first few bars, the first few measures of this piece. So here we have the first prelude of this first book of Debussy preludes, written at the end of the first decade of the 1900s. And it goes something like this. So let's just focus on that. Debussy's style, this style of impressionism, influenced by the painters of the end of the previous century, painters like Monet, kind of being a little bit vague, creating the impression of something without defining the thing itself. You can kind of hear all that happening. Debussy, who often writes quite slow music, sometimes very fast figures, but sometimes with an underlying slow tempo. Debussy, who often writes in block chords, often parallel chords. When you look at them, they're often full of consecutive octaves and consecutive fifths and all these things that musicians spend their lives trying to avoid. Debussy's not too worried about all that stuff. They're there for a particular effect of texture. He does some very interesting things with the texture that we're going to think about, and he does some very interesting things with the harmony that we're going to think about. So let's work our way through this handful of bars and just see what we can discover about how Debussy creates that kind of haunting quality. Well, there's a key signature in this piece, isn't there? There are two flats, and it looks as if we're going to describe the key of this piece, we ought to hit B flat major, because the very first chord is a tonic chord of B flat major. So when you hear that first chord, there's nothing ambiguous about it at all. You're saying, there's the tonic chord of B flat major. Having done that, the next chord is really ambiguous, because you hear that and you think, what's all that about? Because if we just leave out the A and the bass for a moment, well, we've got this chord, haven't we? Well, what is that chord? It's basically an augmented chord built on E flat, isn't it? So in B flat major, is that a chord? Absolutely not. The nearest chord to it would be that, chord 4. So you could say, well, he's kind of taken chord 4 and he's augmented it. But then, having sort of put that upstairs part of that chord into first inversion, he then has A in the bass, which is a complete contradiction with that. Well, you might think maybe this A in the bass is some kind of passing note or something. But it isn't that either, because the bass goes B flat, A, and then it leaps down to F. So you see what we've got here, which is a fascinating thing, kind of juxtaposition of a chord that's absolutely diatonic, central to the key, B flat major, and then we get this E flat augmented chord with an A in the bass, which kind of feels relatively dissonant, doesn't it? Because the A in the bass, of course, is a tritone away from that E flat at the bottom of this E flat augmented chord. So it's a relatively dissonant sound, but it's slightly eerie, isn't it? Slightly kind of mysterious sound. So we go from a transparent sound of the tonic chord to this really eerie, haunting sound, where we think that's not tonal. It doesn't sound kind of radically atonal either. And one of the things Debussy has this amazing knack for is to park a tonal chord next to something that's not tonal and actually make the two things work. Whereas many composers have this problem of, well, if you put a tonal chord here and an atonal chord there, they just sound like two chords from two completely different pieces. Debussy brings it off remarkably well. So we've got the B flat tonic chord, we've got the E flat augmented chord with the A natural and the bass, much more dissonant, mysterious, haunting. Then he puts in a little passing note in that middle part. And then suddenly, even though that's a fairly innocuous passing note, isn't it? You know, it's only a semiquaver, a 16th note. Actually, when you look at this chord, it's possible to say, well, this looks like an A diminished chord with a 7th in it. Just changing that B natural to C completely changes the ambiguity of that chord for something that is actually much clearer. Now, how do we relate that to B flat major? Still with some difficulty, because that is a 2-7 in G minor. G minor is the relative key of B flat major. So if there's a link, that's it. I don't think this is how Debussy was thinking about it, but just in terms of how does he get away with this notion of parking something that is really ambiguous next to something that's crystal clear? Well, he does it by crystal clear, totally ambiguous, less ambiguous. So you see how that works. It's quite clever, isn't it? And then we come to the third chord of the first bar, the first measure, and we think, okay, that wasn't as mysterious or quite as haunting as the second beat of that bar, but nevertheless, it's still an interesting one, isn't it? Because this is this chord. It's an F augmented chord. Now, in the key of B flat major, the nearest chord to that is chord 5, isn't it? So if I take the C up to C sharp, it's an augmented chord 5. Now, one thing that happened in the kind of 19th century is we sometimes had chord 5. We then augmented it in order to take us on to chord 1. And it's a little trick really that Debussy is playing here, because we get this augmented 5 there, followed by chord 1. So it's a fascinating mixture of things that are sort of functioning with things that are not really functioning. So when I put those first 4 chords together, you can hear how this haunting progression works so beautifully well. Back with that chord 1 again, and we really feel as if we've gone home to the tonic chord, don't we? Well, what happens in bar 2? Almost exactly the same as what happened in bar 1. So we've got the tonic chord again, we've got this second beat doing exactly as it did before, the third beat is doing exactly as it did before, but we've just got this little hop up to a 16th note F at the end of that second bar, the end of the second measure. That doesn't fundamentally change anything harmonic, but it just means there's a slight difference between the second bar and the first bar, some sense of evolution, some sense of minor development over the first bar. So that's really interesting how we've got this kind of chord 1, absolutely rock solid, standard, conventional chord. The second beat of the bar, very mysterious, going to something slightly less mysterious, going to something on the third beat that's kind of not quite diatonic either, has a sort of relation to something functional, because augmenting the 5 to go back to 1 over the bar line is what it's doing. Okay, well, if that's what's happening in the first 2 bars, how does this take us on to the third bar, the third measure? Well, again, at the end of the second bar, the second measure, we've got the chord we talked about, that F augmented chord. And before, it was going back to the B flat major tonic chord. This time we're doing something else. We're going to this chord. Well, at the beginning of bar 3, what is this chord? Well, really, that is a 2-7 in first inversion in the key of F major. So, are we modulating to F major? if we are, that's a totally logical thing to do because F major is the dominant key of B flat major, the home key. So maybe he's just going to go 2, 7 in first inversion, chord 5, 7, chord 1. That would be conventional. He's not doing that, of course. He goes on, interestingly as well, using this little upper auxiliary note or upper neighbor tone. And then he changes that first chord by having a B natural in the bass. So is that some kind of sort of chromatic movement that's going on? Well, it is, because the bass is going B flat, B natural, C. So it could be that he's going 2, 7B in F major. Then he's using this as a secondary dominant because it's 5, 7 in first inversion in C major. So he then goes to C major. Well, he's not doing that either. So we get this 2, 7 in first inversion in F major. We then get this thing, which is a chromatic alteration of the bass. But you could say we're now listening to a 5, 7 in first inversion in the key of C. But then on the third beat, we get the most ambiguous thing happening in this bar, don't we? Because how do you describe that chord? It's pretty difficult, especially with the F and the G there. And we've also got E flat. So we've got E flat, F, G, all going on together. So that's a little bit ambiguous. When he goes on to the A, well, does that clarify things a little bit? Possibly. You could say this is some kind of 5-7 chord in B flat major that's extended, because if I take chord 5 in B flat major, it's that. Put a 7th on it, I get my E flat. Put a 9th in it, and I get my G. So that sort of takes care of what's going on there. So you could say it's a sort of 5-9 situation there, couldn't you? In B flat major. Is this what Debussy's thinking? I doubt it. But what's interesting about it is that you get chords that are straight down the line tonal. You get other chords that are kind of like a little bit off beam. You get other chords that when you sit and think about it, you think, actually, there is something sort of functional about them in relation to the home key. So there's a bit of that going on there. It goes on to the next bar, the next measure now, and we have this alteration of the previous chord. Now, what's changed? Previously we had this, so E flat's gone up to E natural, C in the bass has gone to C sharp. So we go on to this very difficult chord to describe. I mean, you could say it's got a sort of C sharp diminished feel to it, which basically explains everything except the F. And of course, the other thing is we've got this F and G thing kind of repeating, haven't we, 4 times. So there's elements of something that's about a C sharp diminished chord, but then other things obscuring it. So sometimes you've got a very clear chord, sometimes you've got a chord that you can sort of identify with something obscuring it. Sometimes you've got a sense of function, sometimes that's less clear. And then he eventually comes down to the second beat of this bar, where it almost feels like we've reached a cadence. Although it's a funny place to have a cadence, isn't it, on the second beat of a bar, where we've got that B flat major in first inversion. So if we just put that together so far, you can hear how all this combines to create this very haunting kind of sound. Other things contributing to that, do a sostenuto, so the kind of sweet sostenuto sound. We've also got these kind of deep octaves in the left hand. It's really giving depth to the texture. And we've got this very chordal, homophonic structure. And then we've got this dotted quaver, semi-quaver, the dotted 8th note, 16th note thing, just kind of adding to the haunting quality that just sort of, there's a hint of it for one beat in the middle voice. And then there's 2 beats of it in the middle voice. Then there's 3 beats of it in the top voice and another one in the next bar. So you see how that begins to evolve in the haunting qualities of this as well. and this sense of resolution there. And then from here to the double bar line that's following on, we get a slightly different approach, because now we've got very much block chord movement, with chord movement on every quaver, on every eighth note. Suddenly an elevated texture, still quite a thick texture when you look at how many parts are going on, sort of 7-part texture and so on. But we've got rid of that low bass line and lifted it to a new place. So that variety of texture that's been achieved is quite interesting. And it separates this from the earlier part of the phrase. And then what we have is something actually much more tonal, because if we start with this PP chord here, we've got B flat major in first inversion, so that's chord 1 in B flat major. We've then got D minor in second inversion. Well, you know, what's D minor in B flat major? It's chord 3, isn't it? And then we've got D minor again, this time in first inversion. Then we've got D minor again, this time in root position. And then we've got G minor, which is a chord 6 in B flat major, but it's also chord 2 in F major. Why do I say that? Because we're going to actually modulate to F major in the next bar for the end of the opening statement of this piece. So this, in fact, at the end of this bar, this G minor chord here, is a pivot chord acting in an entirely conventional way. Then, having gone through the pivot chord, we've got chord 5 in F major, then chord 6, then chord 4, then chord 5, and then chord 1. So do you see, all the way through from here to the end of that first little section is entirely tonal and entirely behaving itself tonally, isn't it? Okay, going from chord 1 to chord 3 is maybe a slightly unusual thing to do, only because 3 is relatively low in the chord hierarchy. And then to have 3 statements of chord 3, second inversion, first inversion, root position, slightly unusual. But in every other respect, it's entirely conventional. It even uses a pivot chord to take us into the new key. And this also adds to the haunting qualities of what's going on in these opening bars, these opening measures, because that is transparent, but it's still PP, it's still veiled, it's still got this kind of thick texture. And it's a total contrast to what's gone before it, which in a way is slightly unnerving, isn't it? So we had those opening chords that we talked about. Back to the tonic chord again. Let's go around the same pattern again. And then let's hint at F major, which is to come, but we're not actually going to do it yet. And then let's have that B natural, gives it a bit of a lift, suggests we might be going to C, but we're not. And then let's have more ambiguity there. And then let's go, B flat major. Thank goodness for that, we're home. B flat major confirmed. D minor, but still a chord in B flat major because it's chord 3. Then the pivot chord taking us into F major because it's 6 in B flat but 2 in F. And then 5, 6, 4, 5, 1 in F major. Entirely conventional. And then as you look on, you think, okay, this is kind of going around the opening again, just sort of slightly changing the texture. And again, he's kind of move into this kind of less obvious territory, only to reclaim this tonal stuff again at this point, before we wander off into some new territory down there. So isn't it clever how Debussy uses this kind of blurred tonality to say, yeah, we're in B flat major. We've got a modulation to F major, the dominant key, but we've got all this kind of detailed blurring of tonality on the way, some of which we can kind of hold on to a few threads of, and occasionally we have to say, well, it's just not at all clear what is going on here. That combined with the tempo, the low dynamics, the texture, is giving us this absolutely totally engaging, haunting quality that we so often hear and see in his music. So I just wanted to examine with you that aspect of this just in this handful of 5 bars of the first prelude. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And if you go onto the home page, just have a click on Maestros. You might well be interested in joining us in Maestros. There are 3 levels of Maestros, different levels of engagement. Level 2, for example, gives you all sorts of perks, including access to a monthly live stream where we do things like this. We look at music and analyse it and just dig down a bit to see what's going on. And we have done a number of live streams on Debussy and Impressionism in the past. And once you've signed up as a level 2 member of Maestros, you have access to all of the previous level 2 live streams recorded, which is going to give you a huge volume of material. So it might be something you're interested in having a look at. Lots of other things on the website too. www.mmcourses.co.uk.